finish up your conversation so we can get this town hall started. We'll start in a minute. All right, I think we're going to get started here. Can everyone please come in? Can you hear me? Can everyone please come in, take your seats, finish your conversation so that we can get this town hall started? All right, I am Palo Alto Weekly editor Jocelyn Dong, and together with my colleague, City Hall reporter Janati Shaner, we are pleased to be co-hosting this town hall on the Stanford General Use Permit with County Board of Supervisors President and no stranger to Palo Alto, Joe Simitian. Supervisor, unlike you, Janati and I didn't run a campaign or get sworn in to be up here on the dais, so I kind of feel like we're cheating a little bit here. But we're looking forward to tonight, and let me explain what we're going to do in 3 parts. So first we'll have introductory remarks, kind of overview and context for the Stanford General Use Permit by Janati Shaner, and then the supervisor. Then we're going to move into a question-answer portion. The supervisor will be answering questions from Janati and myself. And then we'll go into the public question portion. So this is how that's going to work. If you don't already have an index card, someone's walking around with index cards, please write your question on the card. And then also write your name. You could do first name, last initial, because we'll be calling you up to the public microphone to ask your question, all right? So we'll be doing that in the 3rd portion, and we'll have about 40 minutes for that. We do have some elected officials here, and I just wanted to recognize the following. Mayor of Palo Alto, Eric Filseth. Board of Education trustee, Todd Collins. Another trustee, Jennifer DiBrienza. Trustee Melissa Baton-Caswell, Trustee Ken Dauber. We have former Mayor Peter Dreckmeyer and former Mayor Pat Burt. County Supervisor Cindy Chavez is here. She's part of the development agreement negotiation team. Trustee, I'm sorry, I forgot, Shauna Gdarop from the Board of Education. Staff member from Supervisor Warren Slocum's office for the County of San Mateo. And Mayor Pro Tem Cecilia Taylor from Menlo Park. Let's give them all a hand, shall we?
And if I may, I think I saw Kavita Tonka from Los Altos Hills here as well. Is she here? Or did I? Oh, go ahead. Don't be shy. Welcome. Thank you.
Former Mayor of Stanford, Representative Chief McCall.
There she is.
All right.
Got it.
Thank you all for being here. That was an invigorating rally, and now we're going to transition to talking about the myriad issues involved with the Stanford general use permit. Earlier this week, the conditions for approval were released by the county, so we'll have lots to talk about. Janati, will you kick us off, please?
Hi, thanks again everybody for showing up on such a beautiful day to talk about general use permit, which is unquestionably the most important project going through the county system right now. And as we're about to hear from Supervisor Simitian, this project has just entered a very critical phase. The county released the final EAR for the Stanford expansion last December, and just this week it has released recommended conditions of approval, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. At the same time, Supervisor Simitian and Supervisor Chavez are preparing to negotiate a development agreement with Stanford, and so is the school district to talk about something called full mitigation that we just heard a lot about at the rally. So I actually think in discussing the Stanford GUP, this could be a good place to start. Supervisor Simitian, you've often talked about full mitigation in discussing the Stanford GUP, and a lot of people in the crowd have held up signs to that effect. My literal interpretation of that phrase means if there's one extra commute trip or, if there's any housing impact, that means the project won't warrant approval. That seems like a strict standard. I wanted to check with you, is this an aspirational goal, a realistic one? And basically, what do you mean when you talk about full mitigation?
Well, I think it's more than an aspirational goal. I think it's a realistic goal. Most of the folks that I hear from share my view, actually, so I feel like I'm in sync with most of the community on this, which is, I think, the vast majority of the people in this room want to see Stanford continue to be a world-class university. They want to continue to see it be a successful university. They want to see the continued benefit of the university that accrues to Palo Alto and the surrounding area, but they want all of that to happen without the adverse consequences of additional development being borne by the local community. So that was a lot of words that could be summed up in full mitigation. And full mitigation to me just means if you want to develop, then as we go through the land use process, we have to ask ourselves, how can you develop responsibly and fully mitigate, fully address any adverse consequences of that development? Now, Janati, when you ask me about one car or one housing unit, you strike me as a kid who was maybe saying always, "Can I come home another half hour later, Mom?" At some point, it's not about trying to play games at the margins. It's about saying, look, whatever it is that our Board of Supervisors is ultimately prepared to approve, the consequences, the environmental consequences of that, and need to be fully mitigated, need to be addressed. And I think that's a reasonable expectation. I think it's a realistic expectation. And the last thing I'll say on this is just, for 20 plus years, as long as I can remember, local communities up and down the peninsula have told their constituencies that when they approved a project, the impacts were fully mitigated. 20 years later, traffic, worse, not better. Housing, worse, not better. So I think there's a fair measure of skepticism out there in the community, which I understand, as to whether or not, full mitigation is a real thing. But I think in this process, it has to be real, and that ought to be not only the aspirational goal, but a very realistic goal, and one that we achieve whatever decision the 5 members of the Board of Supervisors ultimately makes.
Supervisor, I would like to ask if you could kind of keep us or catch us up to date on this process, because it's gone for a couple years now. And with the release this week of the conditions of approval, I'm hoping you can update us on what the significance of that is in this whole process.
Sure. So, you know, for the weekly, there's some late-breaking news, I guess, which is that, you know, just within the last 24 or 48 hours, the Santa Clara County staff, the professional staff, have released a summary of their proposed conditions of approval for the project. And it is this not very exciting-looking document that's at the table in the back. And if we have some copies, Antonia, could I ask you to grab some copies in the back and just pass them out to folks who want a copy? And this is what our staff is telling us they think full mitigation looks like. And it touches a number of areas that people have spoken about, and I'm guessing we'll get questions on: transportation, traffic, housing, schools, open space protection, flood protection, so on and so forth. And I want to underscore again 2 things. This is the headlines. So this is not, you know, the full story, but the staff thought it would be helpful, and I agree, to sort of say, look, here's our sort of bottom line take on what mitigations might look like. And then the second thing I want to say is that ultimately these are the staff's recommendations. The final decision is going to go up through our Planning Commission and then to the 5 members of the Board of Supervisors who will actually make the decision. So the conditions of approval might look like this, but they could be very different in at least some respects. And I want to say again, thanks to my colleague Supervisor Chavez, who's here, because she is serving with me on the development agreement team, but she'll also be one of the 5 members who will ultimately vote on an approval and will be mindful of whether or not these conditions of approval get the job done. The other thing I should say is, you know, I think we're going to try and wrap this up this year. You know, one thing we can all agree on is if we could have fewer meetings and more progress, that would be a good thing. I know both the applicant, the university, and I certainly would like to move this along, but we need to move it along in a way that makes sure that the job gets done and that we're, you know, rigorous and thorough in the work. I had hoped that that would be by June of this year. That's not going to happen. And now we're targeting a time sometime this fall, October, November, and that process is sort of already underway. Our Planning Commission has already had, I think, the first of 2 study sessions just recently. There will be others. They'll ultimately weigh in. Why don't I stop there, because we could talk process all night. But if you haven't picked up a copy of this document in the back, or as somebody pass it around, it's the thing that says this is what county staff is suggesting is necessary in the way of mitigations, and it's available on my website if you lose it or would rather just do it digitally. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. And one of the most striking things about this document you just mentioned is the housing section. And the reason I found it striking is because what the county staff is suggesting differs quite markedly from what Stanford had initially proposed in its application. Stanford's application, of course, called for 3,150 units/beds, which included about 550 faculty units. Right now, what staff is suggesting and what the supervisor will be reviewing is something around the range of between 4,700 and 5,700 units. So I was hoping to get your thoughts about the housing discussion and this kind of movement by the county towards exploring alternatives with more housing and potentially requiring Stanford to provide more housing than initially proposed.
Sure. I'm going to come at it slightly differently in terms of how I think about it.
Great.
And I hope my virtual blackboard will work for people here. The Environmental Impact Report, the EIR, anticipates that development at the level proposed by the university would produce 9,610 new folks on the campus. So that's sort of a key number for me, 9,610. I think it's important to distinguish, and we sometimes are a little casual about this, the proposal for housing from the university was 550 units of housing and 2,600 beds. Now, a bed is not a unit. It's not a housing unit. So the way I look at it is, if there are 9,610 new folks on the scene, the 2,600 beds will take care of 2,600 people. I don't want to get more personal than that. That leaves us with 7,010 people and 550 beds. I think that math is pretty simple. 9,610 folks, 2,600 of them will have a bed. That leaves you with 7,010 people, but only 550 units of housing. And you can tell where I'm headed when I use the word only. I don't think 550 units of housing is sufficient to address the housing need of those 7,010 folks who are left over after we remove the beds. So that has been a source of discussion from almost day one with respect to the proposal. Some of you know that the EIR, the Environmental Impact Report, was recirculated to look at some additional options with respect to housing. The staff has come back and they have proposed that we look at a minimum of 2,170 units, 2,172 units of housing rather than 550 units. So roughly a quadrupling of the housing would be required under the staff proposal in terms of housing units as compared or contrasted with the initial proposal from the university.
So the conditions of approval indicate that 70% of the market rate housing and 40% of the affordable housing would be located on campus, which leaves the remainder off campus. I know that there have been people who have been concerned about traffic impacts and other impacts from having some people living off campus. And I wanted to ask you, can you comment on the rationale for not having 100% of all housing required the 4,800?
Sure. So I think one of the topics that has been front and center over the past year or two is who bears the burden of the demand for additional housing, and how can the university most successfully, most fully mitigate the impact of any housing demand they create. And one of the things we've talked about is whether or not we can condition an approval on on-campus housing, at least in part. The proposal from our staff, and again, I want to keep underscoring, these are just proposals at this point, and they are from the professional staff. These are not decisions from the elected officials. The proposal from our staff is that at least a minimum, 70% of that housing requirement be accommodated on campus. And I want to underscore something here, because this is sort of easily overlooked. That's not a proposal that the housing be provided for free, or that the university not charge for the housing, or that in fact they don't make a profit on the housing. Many of you are familiar with the Stanford West neighborhood. That's Stanford housing that people are charged to rent for and pay. And that's certainly something that is possible here. But the notion is that the majority of the housing, in this case 70% is the staff recommendation, would be on the campus so that it most effectively and efficiently solved the housing crisis, that the units were real, and that they addressed the needs. I see some of the Stanford workers here in the front row looking intently at me. I think that's the notion. Now, one of the mantras that both the university and the county have often fallen back on is flexibility with accountability. So the university has repeatedly said, we'd like as much flexibility as possible, and that's not unusual from an applicant or a developer. As you can imagine, at the county, my focus is not only on the flexibility, but also on the accountability part. And the goal here is to provide some flexibility so that these other units could be provided close by in the neighborhoods that are, and the cities that are most affected by the development. So it's not accidental that we have a representative from Los Altos Hills and from Menlo Park here. They're here, I mean, I don't presume to speak for them, but they're here because what we do in the unincorporated portion of Santa Clara County will have an impact not just on Palo Alto, but on surrounding communities as well. And if we don't fully mitigate the housing impact, those communities will also experience the impact of that.
So were you saying that the reason why 100% of housing couldn't be on campus was the desire to provide the flexibility to Stanford then?
Well, I'm gonna be a little cautious here just because they're not my proposal. They're
Sure.
the proposal from staff. But there is a desire, you know, as I've heard from the university over the past few years now on this, and back in the day when we did all this 19 years ago now, you know, the desire for flexibility was a repeated and recurring theme, and part of that flexibility had to do with the ability to do some of the housing off campus. There is this 6-mile radius that is designed to make sure that the off-campus housing development mitigates the pressure of demand in the surrounding communities.
During the NICE rally before this meeting, you made a point in your remarks that impacts to schools are one kind of issue in which you don't have too many tools in your CEQA toolbox. As you know, the Palo Alto Unified School District has been, for months, been requesting that Stanford commit to a contribution for additional student demand. So I wanted to ask you, do you believe the PAUSD's proposals are reasonable in terms of financial contributions and a site for potentially new school? And if not, what obligations, if any, do you think Stanford has to the local school district?
Well, Gennady, I'm sure you can understand that I'm, to some degree, not going to be able to negotiate through the Palo Alto Weekly tonight.
I can dream.
You've got to ask, and I've got to not fully answer. So we have a job description. Let me say this, though. For those of you who are not aware, the school district has said, hey, we need a school site in the vicinity of all these new kids who would be part of our district if the university continues to develop. And hey, not only do we need a school site, but we need some money to build the school. And third and finally, over the long haul, if there are more students, but there is not additional tax revenue by virtue of the university's tax-exempt status, then that means that Palo Alto has fewer dollars per pupil to spend on kids in the district. So the school district has made the case that some kind of ongoing annual support would be appropriate as well. And I don't want to get too off in the weeds about school finance, but this is a function of the fact that we're what's known as a basic aid school district, or now these days sometimes called a locally funded school district. So additional kids don't bring additional support, not significant additional support from the state. It means that the existing tax revenues of the Palo Alto Unified School District just get spread a little thinner among whatever number of students are in the district. I think all three of those are certainly legitimate concerns. As I said outside, I want to be very clear about this, there are limits to what our Board of Supervisors can compel or require or condition in the land use process, and this is a function of state law. So for example, there is a developer fee statute that spells out what the rules are for how much you can expect someone to pay in fees towards school construction. It's a relatively modest amount. It is far from sufficient to actually get a school purchased and built. So that's where some of the conversation will take place. But again, state law precludes my colleagues and I on the Board of Supervisors from changing that developer fee amount unilaterally. Similarly, the school funding formula that says, in effect, you'll live with your tax revenues no matter how many kids get added, that's state law. And the tax-exempt status, property tax exemption status of the university's properties is also a function of state law. So, does that mean you throw up your hands and give up? No, which rather clearly the district has not done. It means that that's going to be a topic I expect in a development agreement conversation. And for those of you who wonder where I just went, I went from talking about what a board of supervisors can actually impose as conditions of approval unilaterally, obviously in concert with the applicant and with the community, but ultimately exercising our police power authority as a governmental entity responsible for land use. If there are issues like these school issues that we can't use conditions of approval to fully address, then we can have a development agreement, a contract, if we can get to yes and essentially get an agreement between the university and the board, which would be informed by this. The one thing we can do, and I should mention it because I see that it is on the handout here, and it's on the portion that actually talks about community plan updates, is there's an indication here that we could designate a school site on our land use maps, and I want to be really careful about the language again. Designate means designate, it doesn't mean dedicate. Now, what's the difference in this context? If we could require a dedication, that would mean the applicant would be obliged to contribute the school site. We can't do that under state law. What we can do under state law, however, is identify a location where there is a need for a school in the future and designate it, put it on the land use maps in our community plan, which is specific to Stanford, which is part of our larger general plan, the governing document for land use. So we can designate, not dedicate, and on these other issues we can negotiate, but in most cases not unilaterally impose. Welcome to my world, everybody. That's what we do.
Before we leave the schools topic, I wanted to loop back to the housing conditions of approval, noting that if there's more housing proposed, 5 times as many faculty units, so before it was 550.
I think it's 4 times as many.
4 times, okay. Then that wouldn't, by necessity, produce more students for the school district. And I know up till now, Stanford has been saying there's plenty of capacity in the Palo Alto Unified to absorb more students. However, if you have more housing as a condition of approval, then it seems like that could radically change kind of the whole conversation between the district and Stanford, and pertain to the per pupil fee.
Yeah, let me just say, I've heard this argument, and here's the part of the argument I'm not persuaded by. I just want to be candid with everybody. The argument goes like this: gee, if you wouldn't make the university actually mitigate its housing impact, we wouldn't have this challenge about where to put the students. Okay. But I really don't think we can have this conversation about 9,610 new arrivals without figuring out what we're going to do to address the housing impact. So, the reason for the recirculated environmental impact report was because we understand that sometimes the solution, the mitigation, in this case, more housing, brings with it its own impacts, which you then have to mitigate. Now, this could just be an endless feedback loop of, mitigation creates impact, creates more mitigation, creates more, and at some point you have to stop. But in this case, I really feel that it's pretty clear that full mitigation requires housing mitigations, and part of housing mitigation is dealing with these schools issues that are part and parcel of that conversation. And, I should just say, because I think we ought to try and strike a little note of optimism here. A week and a half ago in the Palo Alto Weekly, there was an opinion piece, I just happen to have a copy with me, by Martin Schell talking about Stanford's commitment to Palo Alto schools. As we heard earlier this evening, the university has recently reached out and started talks with the district. That's a change in their posture. And I, for one, welcome the evolution of thinking that has led to that. And if there's been a turnaround on this issue, good, great. My own view is, the requirements of law are obviously the starting point, but then you ought to talk about, all right, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? But most persuasively, what's in the university's own self-interest? I mean, when I talk to some of the school district folks, they're like, we're baffled. We're trying to build a school in the middle of a Stanford neighborhood to serve Stanford families. Why doesn't that get embraced as a wonderful opportunity? And my hope is that as the parties continue to talk, they'll reach that conclusion and find a way to get to yes.
Cool. Well, let's pivot to a less complex and cheerier topic, which is traffic. Stanford, in its last general use permit, had a no net new commute trips policy, which many have heralded as a huge success. It reduced solo driver rate from, I think it was like 69% in '03 to about 43% now. A few people have seen some flaws in that, in the way it calculates peak hours. And I noticed that in this new handout, there's some methodology changes. There's a 3-tier system. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your assessment of how well this policy has worked, and what, if anything, you think should be changed about no net new commute trips this time around.
Yeah, I think for those of you who follow land use, bless you, but for those of you who follow land use, you know that often the conversation is, well, here's the impact. What could be required in the way of mitigations, meaning fixes or payments towards fixes for traffic that a new project creates? That's kind of a traditional approach. 20 years ago, when we did this the last time, and some of you will know that I was on the Board of Supervisors then before I went off to Sacramento and came back, but 20 years ago we said, let's take a more forward-looking view and talk about not imposing fees for projects that are out there, not mitigating adverse impacts, but seeing if we can actually eliminate the adverse impacts. And, it was considered relatively cutting edge at the time, the notion that instead of saying, well, we're just going to have to accept this additional traffic and, build new streets, new roads, new intersections to mitigate it, back to this notion of flexibility with accountability, we said, look, if you can meet your no net new commute trip goals, then that's the best of all possible worlds. You won't have to pay fees you don't want to pay, and we won't be dealing with additional traffic that none of us wants to see. In the intervening 18, 19 years, we've learned some things. One of the questions that was asked repeatedly during the EIR process and that the staff looked at was, is there a better way to measure this notion of no net new commute trips? And the way it has historically been done for almost 20 years now is the peak hour of traffic going into the university during the morning commute and the peak hour traffic leaving the university during the afternoon or evening commute. And both the professional staff and the community said, well, that's good, but it's not like rush hour is really only an hour. Shouldn't we be looking at the 3-hour period in the morning and in the afternoon? And by the way, there's more and more of a reverse commute phenomenon. So shouldn't we be looking not just at who's coming into the campus in the morning, but who's leaving? And in the afternoon, not just who's leaving, but who's coming into the campus? And by the way, 3 hours is better than an hour, and reverse commute's an important factor, but really isn't the question, what's the average daily traffic look like, since this is now a year-round, everyday challenge. And so that's why I think you see the staff proposed conditions of approval here referencing we're going to go to a 3-hour period as well as a 1 hour. We're going to do the reverse commute as well as the conventional commute. And we're going to look at average daily traffic year-round. And if we do all of those things, I think then we can make the case to the community that that is a rigorous, meaningful way to measure traffic. Now, if the university can do no net new trips, and you'll sometimes see that it is described as a no net new commute trips goal, well, if they can meet that goal, then they haven't created any additional traffic, and therefore there's no expectation that they would contribute towards mitigations. I think that's going to be very hard to do going forward. And so then the question is, to the extent that they are not able to fully mitigate through this standard, what projects are out there that they might contribute to so that they offset any impact that they have? I'm sorry, I know that's long and complicated and technical, but as you hinted, the traffic stuff is long and complicated and technical.
So just to follow up, when I read the words peak period, I should think to myself 3 hours.
Yes, peak hour, you should think cleverly, 1 hour. Mm-hmm. Peak period, 3 hours.
Okay, that's important clarification. And did you want to follow up?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'll follow up on traffic. So obviously not everyone is driving these days. Stuck on 280, they just want to get out and get into something else. So many are taking Caltrain, connecting to the Marguerite. What do you think is Stanford's obligation to contribute funds for grade separation projects that are going on up and down the corridor?
Well, again, I perhaps should have indicated earlier, so I have a background in land use law. I also have a master's in city planning from a university on the other side of the bay. And I am a certified planner, or have been a certified planner. I don't think my dues are current, but with the American Institute of Certified Planners. And so I come at this very much from a, with a respect for process and rules. And so when you ask about what about this project or what about that project, what I say is, if the university can fully mitigate the transportation impacts of 9,610 people and get to no net new commute trips, then there's not a lot we're going to be in a position to impose in the way of further mitigations. If they can't, then, Jocelyn, then we start to talk about, well, what are the most desirable projects for mitigation funds to be used for in terms of mitigating the impact. I think one of the challenges, I think, Janati, your earlier question was very clear about sort of acknowledging what the university has been able to accomplish over the last 20 years. That being said, that means the low-hanging fruit has sort of already been plucked. Every additional increment of trip reduction is that much harder to achieve. So, we'll see. Again, want to provide as much flexibility as possible, but also, while we're being flexible, we need to be rigorous about the way we measure no net new commute trips, and I think that's what you see in the staff recommendation is sort of a more rigorous approach to making sure that that is what it is and what it's supposed to be.
All right, speaking of measurement, some commenters on the draft EIR have challenged the assumptions and methodologies used to analyze increases in school population, housing, transportation impact. I'm wondering, how confident do you feel that the measures being used will adequately predict future reality? And are there any methodologies that you're kind of questioning?
Well, I think I've yet to see an environmental impact report that wasn't questioned by a significant part of the community. And I don't mean that in a flip way. I mean that I think that's a very healthy thing. I think people should be questioning the assumptions. I also think that our planning commission should be questioning the assumptions, and our board of supervisors should be questioning the assumptions. And Kathy Schmidt is here from our planning commission. I see, thank you, Kathy, from the county planning commission. But one of the responsibilities we'll have if and when we're prepared to approve a project is we also have to vote on the adequacy of the environmental impact report. So that's a process that will continue right up until the final moments. I would tell you in general, I think the environmental impact report has been done, the environmental assessments and environmental impact report, part of that, have been done in a rigorous way. Even professionals in the field will differ about how to do certain things. I think, one of the reasons this is taking longer is because people are doing just what they're supposed to do, which is go back and look at the comments on the environmental impact report. There was a draft environmental impact report. It was circulated for comment by members of the public, including the surrounding communities. Those comments were forthcoming. And the expectation then is that the staff will respond to them. And a lot of those comments do question the methodology. And the reason it's taken as long as it is because people are going to go back and double check. And the university itself has questioned our methodology on a housing mitigation fee. Fair enough. I'll tell you that it's the same methodology used by cities up and down the peninsula. And I'll also tell you that it was approved on a 5-0 vote by our Board of Supervisors after we heard from County Council, our legal counsel, about it. There are some folks out there who are concerned that the historic heritage efforts may not have been as rigorous as was possible. And at that point, here's what I would say. It's one thing to be legally sufficient. It's another thing to say, no, we did our job as fully and as well as we could and should. And what I would say on these methodology questions is merely being legally sufficient, that's the floor, that's not the ceiling, that's the place you start. So, on historic heritage issues, for example, I have no lack of confidence. I feel quite sure that, what's been done is legally sufficient, but I'm hearing from our Historic Heritage Commission that maybe a little more rigor would be desirable, and they're in the process of having those hearings right now.
And I'm sure you've heard from our great environmentalist community that a little more rigor on protecting the foothills is also desirable, and they would probably be happy to see in the list of conditions that county staff is proposing extending the duration of the academic growth boundary, which is the campus basically, not including the foothills, from 25 years, which is existing, to 99 years, which would basically mean Stanford would not be able to develop in the foothills unless there's a 4-5 vote by Board of Supervisors. I was hoping to get your thoughts about this particular policy. Why do you think this should be added, or do you support this kind of approach on the new general use permit?
Well, thank you, because that allows me to again say these are staff recommendations. And look,
Also Peter Dreckmeyer's.
Well, if I remember Mr. Dreckmeyer's comments, just so you know, I listen carefully at these hearings, he called out for protection and an academic growth boundary in perpetuity, which is another word for forever. And, we had this conversation 20 years ago about what was appropriate in terms of development above Junipero Serra, which is the primary dividing line for this academic growth boundary that you referenced. And we did a couple of things that I thought were, big steps forward. The property above Junipero Serra, the foothills, the dish, whatever you want to call it, was rezoned. It had been zoned A1, which means nothing to anyone, because it's sort of a general purpose zone. Sort of show up, ask for a use permit, and we'll think about it. I think, many people, myself included, thought that that was not the kind of protection that was appropriate to the area above Junipero Serra. So today that land is designated for open space / field research. At the same time, we drew a line mostly, although not precisely, along Junipero Serra Boulevard and called that the academic growth boundary. And the notion was that the university could continue to grow on this side of that academic growth boundary, but not up into the foothills. And then the question was, well, how do we make sure that on any given day, 3 members of the 5-member Board of Supervisors don't just decide to change the zoning or move the academic growth boundary? And that's a subject of particular sensitivity because unlike the Palo Alto City Council that is elected citywide, our Board of Supervisors is elected by district. And so there's only one of the 5 voting members of the board that represents this area. That would be me. The other 4 members come from other parts of the county and are less vested in and often less knowledgeable about this area than your district supervisor is, or at least should be. And that is not a criticism of them. I obviously know less about the world in Morgan Hill and Gilroy than the district supervisor who represents them. So back to the open space. The 2 things that matter are the zoning that's there and that academic growth boundary. Now, 20 years ago, the decision was made in order to make sure that on any given day it doesn't suddenly go away with 3 votes of the Board of Supervisors, let's require a 4/5 vote, a supermajority, for such a change to be made. And the debate at the time was, should that 4/5 vote be required for ever, for a year or two, and ultimately we settled on 25 years. That 25 years expires in 2025, 6 years from now. So the question is, would there be any sort of supermajority protection for an academic growth boundary, keeping the development on this side? Would there be any protection beyond the next 6 years? And the application from the university did not propose any additional years of protection. And I don't begrudge them that. I'm only speculating, but I'm pretty sure they thought, well, why should we put a number out there just to negotiate against ourselves? We'll see what the process produces. Fair enough. The staff has now come forward and said 99 years seems like a reasonable proposal to them, and that is in part a function of the Sustainable Development Study supplement that was recently performed that said, well, look, if you go to the core campus, 1,000 acres in the 4,000 acres that are in Santa Clara County unincorporated, you could nearly triple the size of the current campus, still not be denser than comparable universities over the course of the next 100 years. So if you can triple the size of the campus in the flatlands in a smart growth way, why would you ever even think about pushing up into the foothills? And, I feel, again, I don't like to try and be a mind reader, but I think that those results probably informed the staff's judgment. And again, just so you know, I read the weekly. I think the weekly's editorialized that given the results of that Sustainable Development Study supplement, that those supermajority protections should probably be extended for at least 50 years. So there are all kinds of numbers out there. The weekly editorial position has been at least 50 years. Staff's professional judgment recommendation to us is 99 years. We've got other folks who are saying in perpetuity. And again, we have to follow the rules, follow the law, respect one another's rights as well as their obligations. And I've got to keep an open mind and will right up to the end of the process, notwithstanding the fact that I have opinions, I've got values, I'm listening to my community. If you ask me, do I think protection of the foothills is an important priority? The answer would be, of course I do.
All right. Okay, thank you. We're going to move into our community question and answer portion right now. So I'll be calling a couple names at a time so you can get ready to come up to the microphone. Again, if you could ask your question in about a minute, that will help us to move things along. And the first 2 people, Hamilton Hitchings on flood and stormwater runoff mitigation, and Peter D. on Stanford Management Company. First Hamilton, then Peter.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to talk about or ask you about stormwater mitigation. It's more of a plug. We bought our house 3 months before the 1998 flood, where I watched 400 of my neighbors' houses flood over the floor, and they had to move out and do remodels. It cost over $40 million. So since then, the first GUP has been built, and now we're proposing the second GUP. So we just wanted to make sure that the first GUP has been fully mitigated in terms of stormwater runoff, and then the second GUP will be fully mitigated in terms of stormwater runoff. And I also had a suggestion. The Stanford plan for the Searsville Dam, that is their preferred plan, would add flood protection. And so that could be viewed as a community benefit. So it might be worth Stanford considering adding that in, and it would certainly be appreciated by the community. Thank you.
Thank you. I should tell you, I remember the flood of '98 well.
It's our neighborhood.
I saw the water rise up the street I live on and come up over the sidewalks. So I have some personal, understanding of just how threatening that is. Fortunately, we escaped without any meaningful impact. I hope it provides some reassurance when I tell you that the university is required to contain all new runoff on the site. I have heard from folks in the community who want to see some additional upstream detention. There are limits to what we can require through conditions of approval because, as I said earlier, we can't require folks to mitigate new impacts if there aren't new impacts that are left unmitigated. That being said, it's my understanding, both from the community people I talk to and the university, that the university's in conversation with the San Francisco Creek JPA, and those conversations are promising. They're taking a while, but everything seems to take a while. So bottom line, what I can tell you is I will be absolutely sure that we look at the issue of flood protection and on-site retention for any new impacts, but we cannot require an applicant to go back and mitigate the impacts from a surrounding area that they did not are not contributing to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hamilton. Peter D., followed by Ron Snow on traffic.
Good evening. I'm Peter Perpetuity Dreckmeyer, and appreciate the weekly and the supervisor holding this town hall meeting. And Joe, I got to tell you, I think you're the best politician I know, and it's because you're.
That may or may not be a compliment.
Best elected official.
All right, there you go.
You're fair, you base decisions on facts and science, and you have a great sense of humor. So thank you for representing us. I think a lot of people look at this as an us versus them, but Stanford is a lot of different things to different people. And personally, I've had several different affiliations with Stanford throughout my life. And I'm wondering if you distinguish between the Stanford community and the Stanford administration/management company. And I'm wondering what it's like negotiating with the administration and management company.
I'm going to take this to a slightly different place, and I hope you find it responsive. I moved here as a 14-year-old kid, went to Palo Alto High School where my dad was a teacher, and realized along with my late friend Gary Fazzino that I was in the place I should be to become the person I was supposed to be. And that was because a lot of people did a lot of good work long before I got here to make this the extraordinary place that it is. Imperfect, but extraordinary. And I am mindful every day of my life how lucky I was that that break came my way. I think any fair-minded person, all due respect, would tell you that the university is a big part of what makes this place extraordinary. So I want to make sure that this place stays extraordinary, and I think the university's continued success is a big part of that. That being said, we've got a set of statutes on the books, ordinances here locally, rules that govern land use, and so when anyone comes forward, the expectation is that you follow the rules, you abide by the law, and you fully mitigate your impacts. And the question is there anything, are these mutually inconsistent goals? Can the university remain extraordinary and be an extraordinary asset while still fully mitigating any adverse impacts of future development? I believe those are not mutually inconsistent goals. And I believe it's my job to make sure that to the greatest degree possible, we achieve both. So, it's not a popularity contest, respectfully. I have folks who are Stanford boosters. I've got folks who are Stanford detractors. And that's not what it is. It's about, here's the proposal, here's the impact, and are we having a serious conversation about how to let folks do what they'd like to do without adversely affecting the surrounding community, without externalizing the costs of their development on surrounding communities. I think we can get it done. Will it be scratchy along the way? Of course it will. You know, there'll be some push and shove. That's the nature of land use debates. But forgive me the sort of personal recollection, but it really does inform my thinking about all this in terms of how we make our way through the process, you know, respectfully, but, you know, rigorously.
All right, is Ron Snow here? We'll have Ron Snow on traffic, followed by Arthur Kay on traffic. I'm sorry, Arthur Kay on El Camino.
So you started this out saying in the first GUP or the GUP from 2001 or whatever, that the one thing that sort of failed was the aspect of looking at the amount of traffic we have now versus what was supposed to be mitigated. And one of the problems, I live near Sand Hill Road and Alpine Road, and so that's sort of my focus, but I'm sure there's the other tributaries that come in from Page Mill and Marsh and Embarcadero too, and El Camino. My point is, and my question is, or my challenge in a way is that, you know, places that are big like this, an example would be San Francisco Airport, or I also grew up in Southern California, so Disneyland, I like Disneyland. Those facilities had dedicated routes to those facilities. They had satellite parking. They have automated mass transit from those satellites to their campuses or to the airport. And what I haven't seen anywhere is this aspect of looking at the impact on Sand Hill Road and on Alpine Road from the standpoint of peak hours, but also, just for my neighbors, I know they're really on this, is the amount of traffic that's caused by these trucks that are doing all this construction that's going to be happening. We have thousands of trucks per week going up and down there that are just construction when there's major construction going on. So there's this responsibility, I feel, that while no new net trips is a great little catchphrase for the campus, there doesn't seem to be the no new net trips from the standpoint of the community that surrounds it. Sand Hill Road is at capacity. We don't want any more traffic. There's 20, 30, 40, I know there's more than that, 40,000, 50,000 cars going through there a day, more than that, I'm sure. And same with Alpine Road. We don't want Alpine Road to grow any bigger, but we want the traffic to be reduced. So my point is some of these things should be a precondition to doing construction. So rather than doing construction and saying, okay, now we're going to do traffic mitigation, let's have the traffic mitigation done first and measure that and ensure that it's been reduced in order as a precondition to do the construction.
All right, let's see what the supervisor has to say for that.
Well, first of all, I will go back and look at Sand Hill Alpine specifically. I know the intersection. I know the challenges of the intersection. And at an earlier point in my life, I used to cycle the intersection, but it's been a while since I got that far out of town. But I'll go back and take a look. I think the point you make about construction traffic is an important one. It is often overlooked, but as I look at our county staff, I can assure you that the construction traffic impacts were considered as part of the environmental impact report process. And I should have called out earlier, forgive me. I'm pretty sure I saw Jacqueline Anchano, who is our planning director here. Ms. Anchano, are you? Yes, thank you for being here. And the consultant we've hired to help give us extra bandwidth on this particular project is Jeff Bradley with the M Group, who's here, and the deputy county executive, who is trying to make sure all these pieces come together, and I very much appreciate her efforts, is Sylvia Gallegos, who's in the back. And I introduced them all in part to encourage you to introduce yourselves, but also because I want you to know that they're here and they're listening, away from 70 West Heading Street, the county government center. Now back to the traffic issues. The no net new trips approach, I think, makes sense as long as the criteria are the right criteria and as long as we measure them in a rigorous, documentable way. And, we don't get to essentially pick out half a dozen places around the Mid-Peninsula that are struggling with traffic issues and say, well, gee, we'd like some money to fix this, or we'd like some money to fix that. We can require mitigations where there are impacts generated by the new development, but we can't require someone, nor do I think we should, to pony up, forgive the expression, for a solution to a problem that they didn't create or aren't creating. Now, what I was trying to say earlier is not that I think our existing system has failed us, because I don't think it has. I think it could be made better and more rigorous, but that I think the system has failed the Mid-Peninsula and the Bay Area generally when you look at how things have gotten worse, not better, in spite of the assurances that are there. One of the things that is a bigger deal than is perhaps immediately apparent as I look at this document is that rather than issue a general use permit for the full 2,275,000 square feet for the 15 to 20 years that that might entail, there is reference here to the fact, actually it's the very first item under development academic summary, and again, this is the proposal, phased development of a maximum of 2,275,000 square feet of academic development to be considered for approval in 25% increments and not more frequently than once every 5 years. And to your point, that's a way, I think, of saying, hey, we had certain assurances about how all this was going to go, how well it was going to work. Let's check our homework and look at the real results, every 5 years, and make sure before that the final sign off on the next increment comes along that things are working as they should.
All right, thank you. So we have Arthur Kay asking a question about El Camino, and then we're going to go on to the housing topic with Priya Graves.
Thank you for hosting this. Just a pre-comment, which is that you mentioned about Caltrain. Thanks in part due to Stanford's success in no new net trips limitation, Caltrain is at capacity. So increases in Caltrain's capacity for the continued no new net trips limitation is fair game for Stanford to contribute to. But let me talk about what I was here for, which is the El Camino frontage plan. According to the tri-party agreement from 1985 between Stanford, Palo Alto, and the county, the frontage on the Stanford side of El Camino is supposed to be without any development on it. So I'm wondering how that will be taken into account with respect to this El Camino frontage plan, and how how the Palo Alto's participation in the tri-party agreement will be carried forward in terms of negotiation for the 2018, or should it be 2019, general use permit for Stanford.
Let me tease you a little bit and say congratulations for squeezing 3 different questions and topics into your 1 minute. Let me see if I can give a shorter answer instead of a longer one. That'll be my challenge. On Caltrain, here's what I would say. I think to the extent that the university's plans to meet the no net new commute trip goal depend on Caltrain capacity, which may or may not be there 5, 10, or 15 years from now, we just need to build in a revisiting of that capacity if that's essential to the, quote, solution. And I think that is in part what's driving the staff to say, let's revisit some of these issues rather than think of this as just a full 15 to 20 years worth of development authorization. The second thing I would say is the 1985 tri-party agreement, and Supervisor Chavez is still here, I just want to point out, that's my district. They cite the 1985 tri-party agreement because people do their homework, so thank you for that. Does call out certain requirements, agreements, expectations. So I'll go back and take a look to see whether the proposal that we've just gotten from staff on the frontage plan is consistent with that tri-party agreement. And the last thing I'll say about the frontage plan is this is where the university and the city meet. And, bluntly, I hear from a lot of folks who say, I don't care what Stanford does on their campus as long as it's in the interior, because then I don't see it and it doesn't impact me and I don't care that much about it. So that being said, when we had a subdivision request recently before our Board of Supervisors, we had some of the Stanford campus residents who came, and they were quick to remind all 5 of us that we're their local government. So, you know, a county building at 70 West Heading Street in San Jose may not seem like a little, you know, the sort of intuitive seat of local government for the faculty subdivision at Stanford, but in fact, that's where it is. And so the folks who were there were exhorting us, hey, Board of Supervisors, do your job, be our local government. And that was a reminder, if anybody needed it, that it's not just about the frontage, that, you know, notwithstanding the fact that this is an independent private university, there's a land use authority that governs the entire 4,000 acres out of the 8,000 total Stanford lands, and that land use authority is the Board of Supervisors for Santa Clara County. So I'll look at the tri-party on the frontage. I'll remember that we are the local government for the entire campus, and we'll definitely be mindful of the Caltrain capacity issues that you raised.
All right, we'll go to Priya Graves, followed by Alexander Canara.
Good evening, and thank you for having the meeting. I have a hopefully brief question. It concerns the building of housing off campus within the 6-mile radius. What land are we thinking this is going to be built on? Stanford has been buying up properties in my neighborhood, scraping houses, replacing them with other houses. Does that constitute new construction? Does that meet the housing requirement? Or, you know, where do we get this land? They aren't making any more of it.
TBD, to be determined, but it is, you know, and I don't mean to be flip by saying that, it really is to be determined. But going back to, I think, the very first question we got about that 70% that would be built on campus, that's one of the reasons why there is a proposal from staff that if there's going to be housing development, that at least 70% of it be on campus, because you know, it's a residential university, and they're creating the housing demand. And as I said, it's development that could be fully reimbursed essentially by virtue of the rents that are, or lease charges that are there. So that's why there's a 70%, I believe, in the staff's recommendation. Okay.
Alexander Canara, followed by Jose Asconuela.
Thanks very much, Joe, for your years of very capable service to us. Thank you. By the way. As a graduate in this extraordinary university in the 60s and 70s, it's clear for years that Stanford had never really considered housing for students that was adequate. And my only point here is that instead of 70%, I think the requirement should be 90% of any new student additions. Thank you.
Thank you. Duly noted. I will say, I think we all want to exhort folks to do the right thing, whatever we think that is. But I've learned over the years in my work that it also helps if you can appeal to their enlightened self-interest. And I think the university has understood that it was in the university's interest to provide housing for their students. And in fact, during my current tenure on the Board of Supervisors, the university showed up and said, you know what, notwithstanding the housing requirements from the GUP back in the year 2000, we feel we need to exceed those requirements with respect to student housing in the Tresidder area in particular, and build more units there. So they confronted what they saw as their own need for more student housing on the campus, and that was approved at the county relatively expeditiously. Went to the Planning Commission, if I recall, and never even made its way to the Board of Supervisors. So I do want to give that acknowledgement. That being said, I don't think you can rely exclusively on the hope and expectation that people will act in their own self-interest or in the public interest, and that's why there are conditions of approval to make sure that, in this case, the issue we're talking about is housing, that those housing impacts don't fall on the larger community to the extent that that can be avoided.
All right, Jose, followed by Jennifer D. on schools.
Good afternoon, good evening, Supervisor Simitian and rest of the members of the community. My name is Jose Escañuela. I'm a Stanford University employee in Stanford grounds, and I'm also the president of the Campus Workers Union, SEIU Local 2007, and we represent over 1,200 of the service workers that feed and help support all of the student functions on the campus. I have a question, and that is going to be, what will you do more to make sure more workers receive affordable rental housing? And I just want to stress how important, how much a need our community is in need of this. I have a text here from one of our members who was evicted from the room that she was renting nearby. She's a Stanford University employee as well. And she's asking me this afternoon if we know anybody who could sell her a cheap car, because that's where she's been living in since last week. Everybody's trying to help find housing for her, but she doesn't even have a car of her own to get to work in. The other thing that I did want to say is that we fully endorse Scope's 2035 linkage fee improvement recommendations and the conditions of approval.
Thank you. On the issue of affordable housing for workers at the campus, a couple of quick observations. One is, separate and apart from the GUP process, the general use permit, our Board of Supervisors adopted 2 ordinances that deal with affordable housing. One of them requires development on those 4,000 acres of unincorporated lands. If it's residential development, it's an inclusionary zoning ordinance, and that would require 16% of the units that were built to be affordable units. And affordable means 120% of median household income adjusted for size and below. The university has sued the county on that particular ordinance. They've just recently amended their complaint, and I haven't had a chance to look at the amended complaint, but we're in litigation on that issue. But what I will tell you is, to address just this issue, we adopted an inclusionary zoning ordinance, just as other jurisdictions up and down the peninsula have for years and years and years, including Palo Alto. We also adopted a housing mitigation fee ordinance, which is designed specifically and exclusively to generate funding for affordable housing. And again, that would apply over these 4,000 acres, so that if the housing doesn't get built, the fee gets paid, and we're then in a position to try and create some housing. Now, I want to be really clear about this. My hope would be that we never saw any of the fee money, because the housing would get built. The goal is not to collect fee money. The goal is to see the housing built to address the need. So that's my hope, but the fee ordinance is there so that if the housing doesn't get built, that there is at least some contribution to the cost of creating affordable housing, and that again is not borne out in the community. Full disclosure, the university thought the fee was too high. My own view was it was only focused on affordable housing, not the need for market rate housing as well. It was less than half of the fee that would have been justified according to the Nexus study that was performed. And it's a fee that doesn't have to be paid as long as somebody actually creates the housing. And we decided not to impose that fee on residential development, which we could have pursuant to state law, but I think most of us felt, well, we don't want to impose a fee on residential development since that could conceivably be a deterrent to residential development, which we're trying to encourage. So in many ways, while there was a very clear and strong objection from the university, I felt that it was, a sensible ground that we finally landed on. Okay? Stay tuned.
Great. So we're going to have a couple questions on schools. First, Jennifer D., followed by Mary O. Or we'll have Melissa.
Jennifer had to leave, so Melissa Baton-Caswell. She left me the following question. In your negotiations with Stanford, through the negotiation agreement, what has Stanford offered in order to mitigate their impact on our schools?
Well, there are some limitations to what I can say about the development agreement process by virtue of the ground rules that we have agreed to. What I can tell you is that the application from almost 2.5 years ago now did not propose any of the 3 mitigations that the school district has asked for. And that in the intervening 2.5 years, none of those 3 mitigations have been offered up to date. That's why I said earlier I was pleased to see that there may be a change in the thinking of the university, because we've got the piece in the Palo Alto Weekly from a week and a half ago that says that the university intends, which of course is future tense, and also, if I understand correctly, there was a meeting between the superintendent and representatives of the university just earlier this week. So I find all that encouraging, but if the bottom line question is, has there been an offer of a site? No. Has there been an offer of construction funding? No. Has there been, other than the developer fees that are offered, and has there, that are required, excuse me, has there been an offer of continued funding for pupils? No. So, we're still at the same place we were 2.5 years ago, but I'm hoping we're about to go to a different and better place. And I should say that because we've been waiting to get these conditions of approval, we've only had 1 meeting of this development agreement group, and that was largely process-driven. And I think more than that I probably need to not say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is Mary O. here? Yes. Okay. Followed by Hannah Williams to ask a question about East Palo Alto.
Hi, and thank you, Board President Simitian. I really appreciate your help with all of this. You actually kind of answered my question, because my question was about the meetings, because on March 12th, the Stanford News, I read different news articles, reported that after that they had initiated conversation with the Palo Alto School District to accelerate the process. And in it, they said after an initial meeting to discuss procedural items in November, county officials have not scheduled a second meeting with Stanford. And so my question was, I know the CRG is meeting, but so which county officials, but I think you just answered that, which is now the official group that will be doing the negotiations. And then who is meetings? Who is meeting them? What meetings are being held? Other than the CRG, I know we're doing that.
So we have a community resource group, they're meeting. Then we're all here tonight, we're meeting. There's a 7-member planning commission, they're meeting. We have a 5-member elected board of supervisors, and as you know, because you've been to some of those meetings, we've been meeting on some of these issues and or related issues. Then as to this issue of the development agreement, and let me just go back to this from an earlier part of the conversation tonight, the development agreement process is designed to be a negotiation where one party says, here are some benefits we would like, and the other party says, great, but here are some benefits we would like. And you can't really have that conversation about what you'd like to negotiate until you have some sense of what you're in a position to require. So it hasn't really been possible to sit down and negotiate potential bargainable benefits, if you will, until we have a set of conditions of approval so that the university can say, now we understand what at least the staff is recommending, and we can talk about things that are outside the ambit of the conditions of approval as negotiable items. But until you get this, you can't have the other conversations, and I think we've all wished it could move a little more quickly, but as I said, and I said this publicly and I felt it strong and I still do, I'm not going to be hurried to a negotiating table until the staff does a thorough professional job of articulating what can and should be required.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hannah Williams, followed by Carol R., talking about residential areas.
Hi, Hannah had to leave, so she asked me to ask her a question. One of the communities most impacted by this process is East Palo Alto, which is in San Mateo County. Is the board considering processes to involve East Palo Alto in a formal way, such as, or perhaps through a town hall hosted in the community?
Well, I can tell you that at my request or suggestion, the professional staff, and Mr. Bradley, you're sitting right here in the front row nodding, have in fact been in the council chambers meeting with officials in East Palo Alto to have some of these conversations earlier on, because I am acutely aware of the fact that the impacts of the proposed development do not stop at the artificial boundaries of Santa Clara County or the cities therein. In fact, one of the challenges over the years has been that there are actually 6 different governmental entities with responsibility for land use for the Stanford lands. So there are 8,000 acres, and some of you think of them as Stanford as, oh, that's Palo Alto. Obviously, tonight we're talking about 4,000 acres that are in unincorporated Santa Clara County, but there are also portions in unincorporated San Mateo County, Menlo Park, Woodside, and Portola Valley. So you got 6 different land use authorities, which makes it a little hard to take a comprehensive view. Then to your point, the mere fact that none of those lands are in East Palo Alto doesn't mean East Palo Alto doesn't have a stake in the outcome. So what I have done is I have pulled together a series of conversations with all 6 of the bodies that have governance authority, and then we have supplemented that with participation by both East Palo Alto and Redwood City, because Redwood City now, as many of you will know, has a substantial amount of Stanford-related development in that community as well. And please bear with me for just a second as I look at the publisher of the Palo Alto Weekly and say, all of this, of course, has been done consistent with the Brown Act and our open meeting rules. Okay, back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, is Carol R. here? We are running out of time, so I'll make this the last question, and then we'll just have a wrap-up.
Thank you very much for holding the meeting tonight. I'm here as a Stanford campus resident, and we have a concern as to why the Stanford residential neighborhood has not been included in the upcoming GUP negotiations. It was included in the 2000 GUP, but it has no longer been part of the new process. I know the Stanford University has told us they have no plans to develop in the area, but we're concerned, especially now that we hear there's going to be 2,000 units perhaps instead of 550 on campus. And we're also concerned because many of the homes are 100 years or more old, and we've also not been included in the historical resource reports that have been generated by Stanford. So we'd like your support as our lone representative to represent us on those issues, if you could.
But no pressure, right?
Right.
Okay. I do want to call your attention to some language that is perhaps a little vague and a little planary, and I mean that in a non-judgmental way, where it says on the Stanford University Community Plan Updates page of the proposal, and again, general plan governs land use for the county, community plan is specific to Stanford lands in the unincorporated county. And if you take a note, there's some language there that says alignment of zoning with community plan designations. The county will evaluate the land development standards as appropriate to determine if they should be updated to implement the community plan policies. I believe that is the answer to your question.
Yes.
I am mindful of this, and I've said so in public meetings. It's an interesting challenge because the university, when it wants to intensify use in a residential neighborhood, says, hey, we're just doing what we've been either told to do or asked to do, which is try and address the housing shortage. The pushback is, well, it's all well and good that you're trying to increase the housing, but that doesn't mean that's the right way to do it or the right place to do it. And that's a tension that we're going to have to sort out, I think, in the next couple of years. I don't think that will all get done before the GUP is processed, and it will probably be heard in our, the issue will probably be discussed in our county's Board of Supervisors Housing, Land Use, Environment, and Transportation Committee, called Hewlett, sorry. And I think that's where those issues are likely to play out in the future. But please know that they are top of mind for me. And this goes back to two other issues, and I know we need to wrap because it's 8 o'clock. One is this issue of, hey, who's our local government? And it's a unique set of circumstances when it's an self-governing private university, but in unincorporated lands. Ordinarily, this kind of development would require annexation to a city. Neither, and I mean this in the most loving of ways, neither Palo Alto nor Stanford University have expressed much interest in being annexed into Palo Alto. That means that the development continues in the unincorporated area. It presents a unique planning challenge, and it presents some interesting governance challenges as well, as you've just suggested.
Well, thank you.
But the other piece is, and I'm sorry for the zoning, but I mentioned earlier A1 zoning. Much of the Stanford campus has A1 zoning, which is a general purpose zone. So you don't really know from looking at that what could, should, would be developed. That's a legacy. We addressed some of that A1 zoning when we looked at this 20 years ago, but much of it still remains. If you go to downtown Palo Alto and you look at the zoning and the setbacks and the height requirements, you can figure out, here's how much development might be allowed there, and you know what the maximum is. You go to the Stanford lands that are designated A1 under the current system, you can't tell. You don't know the answer to that. What does build out on that parcel or parcels look like? There is no answer to that question. So I do think we're going to need to take a more careful look at the zoning, as well as these issues about where housing density takes place, to make sure that we get the best of both worlds, which is the housing we need, but with preservation of neighborhoods and historic resources to the extent that it's appropriate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, we didn't get to quite everyone's questions tonight, and I do apologize for that. Supervisor will be here afterwards if you want to ask your question of him directly. Also, a video of this session, I believe, is recorded and will be available on the supervisor's website. So thank you for coming, and let's just give a hand to Supervisor Simitian for sharing his expertise.
And thank you to you all for coming, and thank you to the Palo Alto Weekly for hosting the event.